Jesus had a message for each of the 7 churches of Revelation. Next, on Israel, the prophetic connection. This place, the Mount of Olives, very near. Fulfilling the prophecy, waiting for the day when the Messiah will come. Jesus had a message for each of the 7 churches of Revelation. That is, the churches that existed in John's day. But perhaps his message was for the church down through the ages as well. The 7 stages of the church, or the ages of the church, beginning with the church at Ephesus, which had lost its first love, its love for him, for Jesus of Nazareth, and ending with the church at Laodicea, that had become complacent, self-satisfied, but essentially lukewarm, neither hot nor cold. And then in another sense, he may have been speaking to the churches of the 21st century, in which the characteristics of the first 7 churches of Revelation are reflected in modern churches as well. Behind me, the Greek Orthodox Church that sits on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, in fact, where Jesus' ministry began. And this church, as with all of the churches today, perhaps in the words of Jesus, there's a message for this church and for all churches in the 21st century.
The book of Revelation begins with a greeting to the 7 churches that existed in John's day. More specifically, these churches were all located in Western Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, and a short sail across the Aegean Sea from the island of Patmos, where John was imprisoned for his Christian faith. As chapter 2 begins, we discover that Christ, through John, had a specific message for each of the 7 churches. Some were commended for their faithfulness, while others were given strong words of counsel and rebuke.
In the book of Revelation, the number 7 is a big number. That number keeps reappearing again and again. And so 7 churches could mean the fullness of the messianic body of the day. And they go in a circle geographically, and it starts in Ephesus and it ends up in Laodicea. And probably this was a letter in those days that was meant to be passed from church to church. Now, I believe that these churches represent different stages of growth and a maturity in the Christian body. And each one of the churches is facing different challenges based on its character and its growth. Some would say that it would represent the different historic ages of the church. I believe that's a very strong possibility, although the text does not say exactly that. It's clear these are 7 actual churches, actual communities of believers that were struggling to meet the challenges of their day. But each one of them is different. Each one of them has a different character, each one of them has different challenges, and each one of them has different strengths and weaknesses.
But what were these churches facing in the closing decades of the 1st century, when Rome ruled the world and Christians were viewed as a rebellious sect of people who were living out of step with Roman standards and loyalties?
We have in the book of Revelation 7 messages to 7 different churches. These were 7 different congregations or communities in which faced unique problems surrounding them in their days. They faced social issues just like we do today. So John expresses these varieties of issues into the 7 different letters to the 7 different churches in 7 different locations, and they all have relevance to what was going on in that day. I think it's important to realize also that the people of God in those days were facing tremendous problems such as the worship of Greek idols or goddesses or Roman idols and gods and goddesses. And so there was a kind of a pressure and a demand for people to compromise with their own beliefs, and certainly based on the Judeo-Christian roots of our faith. And therefore people were suffering or being thrust into a wind tunnel of deep problems and troubles to challenge the issues of faith in their day.
But do these 7 messages to first century churches have any relevance for churches that exist today in the 21st century? And if so, which of these messages is the most important?
We see in the expression of the 7 churches in the book of Revelation many illustrations and examples that are germane to the church today, I believe. Some of them aren't very flattering, to say the least. And we have to really watch ourselves, because I think we're in all of them somewhere along the way, if we're honest with ourselves. And those churches were symbolic of a warning. The whole book of Revelation actually is a letter. It's a warning letter, and it begins with a greeting and it ends with a salutation. And in between is a lot of very important information that help us to live today as hopefully effective believers in a world that's going through a time that's preparing for the things that John spoke about.
When the writer is writing to the 7 churches, there's a message for today's church. Each one of these churches is facing challenges that we could see in today's church as well. False teaching, complacency, lack of love, losing their passion and their zeal. We see this in the present day church as well. But I believe that it's accentuated as the pressures of the end times come on the churches that will be standing at the time of the return of the Lord. And so this is what really makes, I think, the message of Revelation so important, that it's not just historic churches, and it's not just churches today that we know about. It's churches that will be standing when the time of Christ's return becomes imminent. And we see those special pressures. And you know, there's something that's revealed, I believe, when we have that ultimate pressure, when we're facing the time of the conclusion of all things and the return of the Lord and the judgment of the world. I believe that there is a truth that will come out shining like a diamond. And I believe we get glimpses of that through this revelation in this very, very special book.
The opening decades of the 21st century already bear witness to unprecedented and increasing persecution of Christians. In fact, some suggest that a Christian genocide is already underway across the Middle East. As the world drifts further into greater unbelief, the road ahead will become much more difficult for those who choose to live by biblical standards. The book of Revelation predicts a time of unprecedented suffering for Christians, but it also reveals that God will have the last word, and that when all is said and done, He will reward those who endure, those who remain faithful to Him until the end. Don't go away. After this short break, Dr. John Tweedy returns with his teaching. Meir Panim is one of the charities that C4I America supports. Providing food and care through soup kitchens throughout the land of Israel, Meir Panim has become a critical source for the most vulnerable. Yet the needs in many communities like Dimona are rising. With the recent closure of 2 other soup kitchens in Dimona, Meir Panim must now expand to care for more people who are in desperate need.
The demand on us has increased by at least 30% over the last year. Thanks to C4I's assistance, we are now going to expand the center and expand the amount of meals which will be going out every day. That is a C4I project, and we're very, very grateful.
Your giving makes a difference in the lives of Israel's most needy.
Please help C4I, help Meir Panim, help people in Dimona.
Call or write today and partner with us with a gift of just $20 or more, and show the people of Israel that you care. We're waiting to hear from you.
As we begin our study of the 7 churches of Revelation, it's important to keep in mind that we know Jesus was speaking to 7 specific churches that existed at the time of the visions that John received and when Jesus spoke to John. But another application could be that Jesus was speaking also of the 7 ages of the church, beginning with the church at Ephesus, the first church, and ending with the 7th church, the one at Laodicea. And then there's another application even than those, and that is that he was speaking to the churches today, in fact in every generation, where the characteristics of the first 7 churches of Revelation could be seen in churches throughout history, and certainly today in the 21st century. Each message to each church has 3, 4, 5 major ingredients. First of all, it is that Christ identifies himself to the church. So this is a message for the church from Christ himself. The other thing is that there are commendations, not for every church, but some churches are complimented for their faithfulness, even in the midst of incredible persecution. Some churches receive a very strong rebuke because Christ is disappointed with their activities, their behavior, and their awful witness where he is concerned. Then there are words of instruction, correction that are offered to certain churches because he finds they have disappointed him and they've fallen short in his eyes. And then there's an encouraging word that comes often at the end, an encouragement to overcomers, to the Christians to stay the course in spite of the persecution. So these various 5 ingredients are found in the messages to the 7 churches. Now, in this episode number 2, we're going to address the first 4 churches, and then in episode 3, we will look at the last 3 churches that are mentioned. If you had boarded a ship by the island of Patmos, where John received the revelation, and sailed east, you would have come to the port of Ephesus, the first church that's mentioned. And then if you had traveled north from there in a clockwise direction, you would have come to each of the 7 churches in turn. You would have come to Smyrna, then Pergamus or Pergamum, then Thyatira, and then Sardis and Philadelphia, and finally the 7th church, the lukewarm church called Laodicea. But let's begin with church number 1, Ephesus. Remember, if you'd sailed from the island, you would have come into the port of Ephesus and you would have come to that first church called Ephesus. And here's Christ's word to the church. To the angel of the church of Ephesus write. Now this may have been an overseeing angel, or it could have been another way of addressing the pastor of the church or the overseer of the church itself. These things says he who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your labor, your patience, and that you cannot bear those who are evil. So immediately words of commendation. And you have tested those who say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. And you have persevered and have patience and have labored for my name's sake and have not become weary. So far the message is positive, encouraging. Then it changes. Verse 4, nevertheless, I have this against you, that you have left your first love. Remember therefore from where you have fallen, repent and do the first works, or else I will come to you quickly and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent. So here we have Jesus saying, there's a lot that I can say, commend you for, but you have lost your first love. You've lost your passion for who I am and why you were called into being in the first place. And then he says to them, something needs to change in Ephesus, and you need to repent and come back fully to me. And of course, he being the Lord of his church. And then we move to the second church that's mentioned, and it's really a persecuted church. And it's the church at Smyrna. And again, the message begins. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. So again, Christ identifies himself to this church. I know your works, tribulation and poverty, but you are rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. It's interesting that Jesus identifies this as the work of Satan, the synagogue of Satan. So we understand that Satan is the one who opposes Christ and his church. And obviously he has people within this church or around this church doing his bidding and affecting the life and the fellowship of the church at Smyrna. But then the encouraging word comes in verse 10. Do not fear any of those things which you're about to suffer. Imagine that Christ tells the Christians in Smyrna, you're going to suffer. He's not going to prevent it. He's telling them to expect it. But he tells them not to fear the things they're going to suffer. Suffering is one of the big mysteries of life, and we wonder why people suffer. Well, it's hard to understand it this side of heaven, but perhaps one day we will. We'll understand more then than we do now. But this was a church that was about to suffer and be greatly persecuted. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison. And Christ seems to be saying, I could stop it, but I'm not going to stop it. That you may be tested. Oh, now we have a reason. It's because of a time of testing, perhaps because of greater persecution to come. And Christians grow in the times of testing. And you will have tribulation, trouble, 10 days. He even identifies a 10-day period in which they will suffer greatly. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. And then we move on into the third church that's mentioned, and it is Pergamos or Pergamum. And to the angel of the church in Pergamos write, these things says he who has the sharp two-edged sword. Of course, that's mentioned also in Revelation 19. I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. And you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr. I find that extremely encouraging. Jesus speaks to a church body, the whole congregation at Pergamos, but he picks out an individual in particular, Antipas, a Christian who became a martyr for the Christian faith. In the 21st century, we have more than enough Christian martyrs as Christians all over the world are being persecuted and put to death. And we're in fact reliving these days that Pergamos experienced nearly 2,000 years ago. And then in verse 14, but I have a few things against you because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam. And then Jesus goes to an Old Testament individual, a figure who, because of personal gain, was tempted to curse the children of Israel. And of course, God intervened, and he didn't. He ended up blessing them instead. But it's obvious that the concern here is in Pergamos, there is an inclination to compromise what you believe for personal gain. That's why the reference to Balaam obviously is given. And he makes another reference to the Nicolaitans, and they were really false prophets who were in fact affecting all of the churches of Revelation with false teaching, false doctrine. But Christ is aware of them as well. So if he's aware of things then, he's aware of things today. He knows what our churches are dealing with in the 21st century. He's well aware of the challenges we face. And then he says in verse 16, and by the way, he says he hates these false teachers that infiltrate his church. Then he says to the church at Pergamos, repent, or else I will come to you quickly and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Now we come to the fourth church that's mentioned in chapter 2. Sadly, it is a corrupt church, and it is at Thyatira. And again, the message begins, to the angel of the church in Thyatira, write, these things says the Son of God. You notice how in each of these messages, Christ identifies himself in various ways. But this identification is the strongest of all, because he identifies himself as the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and his feet like fine brass. And he goes on, he knows their service, their faith, and your patience, and your works. And as for your works, the last are more than the first. So it's a great word of commendation and encouragement. And then the nevertheless comes. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. Now, Jezebel may have been the name of a woman, a literal name. It may also have been a name applied to this woman because she had the character traits of the Old Testament Jezebel, who in the time of the kings brought the Baal religion into the northern kingdom of Israel and thereby corrupted it. And of course, and she with her husband, King Ahab. But of course, Elijah the prophet stood up against that and challenged the priests of Baal and called fire down from heaven to demonstrate that the God he served, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was the one true God. So here we have this woman bringing sexual immorality into the church and seducing the servants of God in this church at Thyatira. And then the word of correction comes again. And in fact, Christ says, I gave her time to repent of her sexual immorality, and she did not repent. And indeed, I will cast her into a sick bed, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of her deeds. I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he who searches the minds and hearts, and I will give to each one of you according to your works. Christ speaks very specifically to each church, and in this fourth church, but then this word of encouragement again, and he who overcomes and keeps my words until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. 4 churches, each with things that can be commended, each with things that Christ finds fault, except for the church at Smyrna, the faithful church. We've looked at 4, 3 more to come in the next episode.
Stay tuned for more from Dr. John Tweedy after this break. Today in the Middle East, Israel stands alone as the only true democracy and free country in the region. Yet even free countries struggle with poverty and people in their society that fall through the cracks. This is especially true in Israel, as they are surrounded by enemies and must focus much of their budget on security. But you can make a difference. Your one-time donation of $20 or more can change a life. By giving today, you will help feed the elderly and Holocaust survivors, build bomb shelters in vulnerable communities, and help children in these areas go to school.
We really wish to thank you for all your support in the past and say that it was very, very helpful for us. We see you as our partners, and we wish that you continue with your support of the children.
When you call today with your one-time gift, as a thank you, you will receive the bi-monthly newspaper Israel the Prophetic Connection and the special documentary 7 Amazing Prophecies Fulfilled. Call or write today.
Behind me is a scene that would have been very familiar to Jesus, both as a boy and as a man. I'm standing on the hills of Nazareth, and he would have looked over this valley, I'm sure numerous times, the valley of Armageddon, in fact. And over my left shoulder, the hill of Moreh, and directly behind me and sort of to my right shoulder, Mount Tabor. According to tradition, Mount Tabor is the setting for the Transfiguration. It's in Mark chapter 9. We're told that Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, the inner 3 of the 12, if you want to think of it that way, and he took them onto a high mountain. The mountain is not named, but tradition says it was the mountain behind me. And there he was transfigured before them. His garments changed, the glory of God came upon him, and they saw his true heavenly glory, at least for a few moments. But not only that, we're told that Moses and Elijah also appeared, and they saw these 2 prophets who had lived hundreds of years before. Now they have appeared, and they are in a conversation with Jesus, and the 3 disciples are observers to all of this. So today a church sits on top of Mount Tabor. Tourists come there from all over the world to see the place of this incredible event, at least according to the tradition. Jesus had 7 messages for 7 churches, and in a sense those 7 churches that existed in the time he gave the revelation to John, those 7 churches really reflect all churches down through history and churches that exist today in the 21st century. And listen to the words in Revelation chapter 1, when John is told what to communicate to the churches. In verse 4, John to the 7 churches which are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is and was and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne. I think that simply speaks of the fullness of God around the throne in heaven. And from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, and the ruler over the kings of the earth. And then when we move to verse 7, this incredible statement, behold, he is coming with clouds, and every eye will see him, even they who pierced him. And all the tribes of the earth will mourn because of him. Even so, amen. And then when we move into the teachings about the 7 churches, chapter 2 and chapter 3 of the book of Revelation, 7 specific messages, one for each of those churches. But Jesus says to each of the 7 churches, and by extension to all churches in every generation, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. It's interesting, people come to the Holy Land, they visit the sites, the traditional places, the Sea of Galilee, and the churches that have been built here and there, like the church on Mount Tabor. People attend church all over the world. But it's not the same as hearing what the Spirit is saying to the church. And in the context of the book of Revelation, we certainly want to hear what the Spirit is saying through the book of Revelation and saying to the church in our generation. Because it would seem that events are running swiftly and we're getting closer than ever to the culmination of the events described in the last book of the Bible, the book that the risen Christ revealed to John. It's one thing to attend church faithfully, even every Sunday, but it's quite a different thing to hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. I think that's why that's emphasized over and over again to all 7 of those churches, and by extension to every church. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
For many years now, C4I America and our partners have been there for Israel, especially during times of war and hardship. Because of this support, Israel's most vulnerable have been cared for by groups like the Jaffa Institute and others.
The Jaffa Institute is an institute that deals with children at high risk in slum communities around Israel.
Each year, organizations like the Jaffa Institute care for those in Israel who are unable to care for themselves. And this is all possible because of people like you.
We'd like to thank C4I and all the partners around the world for their support and love and blessing on the Jaffa Institute.
With your monthly support of $20 or more, you are making a real difference in the lives of Israel's most needy. And when you become a monthly supporter, you will receive the bi-monthly newspaper Israel the Prophetic Connection. And while supplies last, the 13-part DVD set of the powerful series Messiah. Call the number on your screen now and become a monthly partner today.